Back in late September, when everyone was getting their collective minds blown by the excellent Mob Psycho 100, I remember going on my anime list and researching shows from the upcoming fall season. Yuri on Ice immediately caught my attention as a MAPPA production headed by Sayo Yamamoto, the director of fan-favorite Michiko and Hachin and the awesome Lupin spin-off Fujiko Mine. I distinctly recall watching the Crunchyroll promotional video and being blown away by the fluid skating animation on display. At the time, I felt like this would be a gorgeous yet typical sports anime that would be too niche to really gather much of a following. That turned out to be far from the truth. Within the first few episodes, the show gained incredible traction, seemingly out of nowhere. Fan art and cosplay of the skaters started pouring in on my Twitter timeline. The shared story of Yuri Katsuki, Viktor Nikiforov, Yuri Plisetsky, and the rest of the ensemble cast immediately resonated with viewers. And this fan interest snowballed to the point of actual figure skaters live tweeting their reactions to episodes. I still can't get over how cool that is. But now that the series is over, it's time to ask the question: is Yuri on Ice worth the hype? Well, that question is never as easy to answer as it is to ask. Actually, I sort of think that asking it is irrelevant in itself, but we'll get into that later. For now, let's take a closer look at what's going on in the show. In early October, when I watched the first episode, I was super impressed. The excellent animation, punchy direction, and immediately well-defined cast left a lasting impression and had me fully invested for the rest of the season. The short opening vignette acts as a metaphorical bookend to the show, treating us to a lovingly rendered Victor, skating and aging before our eyes, as Yuri looks on in awe through the years, indicating the inherent distance between these two characters, both as athletes and as people. Soft piano chords and Yuri's narration give way to one of the most iconic anime openings in recent history in the form of Dean Fujioka's History Makers.
Yes, we were born to make history.
This OP really sets the tone for the entire series, getting us pumped for some optimistic, well-animated gay boy figure skating action. From there, the episode blazes forward with Yuri's failure at the Sochi Grand Prix final. The pace is pretty breakneck, with Yuri's little chibi exposition segments covering a lot of ground very quickly and effectively. This is contrasted by some lovely moments of quiet and contemplation that allow the viewer time to really inhabit the lovingly crafted backdrops painted for Yuri's family home. This first episode is chock full of excellent examples of visual exposition. In the bathroom scene toward the beginning, the blue, white, and red of the background reflect Yurio's jacket, creating a visual fidelity between character and environment. This in turn makes Yuri's all-black outfit stand out, reflecting the isolation and alienation he feels from the figure skating community after his failure. Another great example occurs towards the end, when we are clued into Victor's presence at the family onsen before he actually appears on screen through the presence of his dog, a plot detail planted in the middle of the episode. After such a stellar opening, it's not much of a stretch to see why some people found the rest of the show somewhat disappointing. As the series progressed, it seemed to lose a bit of that directorial intentionality, focusing more on driving the plot forward and shedding that shiny first episode polish. The most obvious complaint is the much discussed drop in animation quality. It's totally normal for a first episode to pull out all the Sakuga to impress viewers and then settle into a more budget-friendly groove. But Yuri on Ice was in the rather tough situation of being a show full of skating scenes that required a huge amount of character movement. I think it's totally admirable that MAPPA chose to animate every single performance instead of using cliched visual tricks like static images with motion lines used in lots of other anime. Unfortunately, some of the mid-season performances end up having a very stilted feel to them, with parts of the characters scaling up at different rates and different frames. People have taken some pretty amusing screen caps of some of the more heinous examples of weird body scaling, but I would argue that these are somewhat misleading. Animation by necessity exaggerates and warps in single frames to imply motion. What matters is the frames taken as a whole in sequence. And I would argue that most of the skating scenes, while not nearly as beautiful as anything from the first episode, aren't on the whole ugly, and certainly don't reach the depths of something like Musashi Gundo. One thing I was a little disappointed with in terms of the art was the lack of visual texture later in the series. Let me unpack that a bit. Early on in the series, we're treated to a lot of varying art styles. Here are some examples. In the first few episodes, we get to see Yuritopia's lovingly rendered backdrops, Yuri, and sometimes other characters, breaking off into bobble-headed monologues, and reality giving way to fairy tale and coloring book motifs, when Yuri explains the story of the Eros performance he came up with, and the triplets explain how the Grand Prix works respectively. What artistic shifts like this do is provide a varied and interesting visual vocabulary to the show. After Yuri leaves Japan, the majority of the series takes place in sterile-looking stadiums and hotels. This does get switched up a bit in the excellent for oh so many reasons Barcelona episode, but generally we stay on the ice for the remainder of the series until after the climax. Despite all of this, I still found the show as a whole to be visually impressive. The sheer amount of character movement is astounding, and the emotional facial animations on the characters after they finish a routine have become some of my favorite instances of animated acting. Well, outside of Kyoto Animation. While there are some problems with the writing, I do think that overall, this is a well-composed show. Yuri on Ice definitely loses the expert pacing of the first episode pretty often, and I really would have loved more instances of quiet like the scenes mentioned before. I also really hoped that the plot thread about Yuri's hometown failing financially would have paid off more than a few passing mentions that the hot springs are doing better after Victor came to visit. The writing is never bad, but there are plenty of little things like this that critics are fair to point out. I have to say though, watching the series a second time really allowed for a deeper understanding of all the care that went into setting up certain plot elements that would pay off later. What seems like mere eccentric flirtation from Victor in early episodes changes entirely when you learn about Yuri's drunken advances at the Sochi banquet later on in the series. Yurio's animosity toward Yuri is given depth and form within his skating as the series progresses, culminating in the realization in both Yurio and the audience that his anger was all predicated on a peculiar sort of affection and admiration for our hero. Perhaps my favorite example of great writing in the show is completely non-verbal. In a stunning example of directorial fidelity, the series beginning with Yuri watching Victor skate alone, and ending with the two skating together, is an excellent example of the harmony between plot, visuals, and tone that the show reaches at its best. This isn't to say that Yuri on Ice is a perfect series by any stretch of the imagination, but honestly, what would a perfect series even look like? Prominent anime YouTuber Giga made an incredible video, linked below, about the tendency in fan communities to strive for objectivity in critiquing media, which leads to an unfortunate amount of policing each other's taste at the expense of allowing yourself to have fun and create subjective, emotional connections to art that touches you as an individual. Yuri on Ice is flawed, but it honestly touched me so deeply that I can say it's now one of my favorite anime series. Sometimes a piece of media just comes into your life at the exact right time, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to espouse subjectivity when explaining why a certain thing is important to you. Here's a fun fact about me. I'm very, very gay. Like, really gay. Like, I love girls so much. And as much as I would have loved watching a bunch of lesbians slip-sliding around the ice, which is what the title more or less implied, I am so thankful for the well-realized depiction of two men in love that we got. Seeing an honest-to-God, not yaoi-baiting relationship bloom within the series was transcendent. And the fact that I and many, well, most, of my friends live in gay baby hell informs our appreciation of the series. But it isn't just that there are gay characters, it's both the content and form that make Yuri on Ice stand out to me. The fact that Yuri and Victor kissed mid-season allowed for much more time and space for the relationship to grow than if the show had opted for a more typical will they or won't they guessing game up until the finale. Having a full 5 episodes where we as an audience knew that these two men were canonically in a relationship made it that much more real. Honestly, this is some of the best LGBT representation I've seen from anime since Wandering Sun's excellent depiction of transgender kids in 2011. The canonical gay relationship is so important, but at its very core, the thing that affected me the most was Yuri's rise to the top. The unbridled rejection of fear and anxiety in favor of optimism and putting all of yourself into something you're passionate about. I spent the majority of 2016 unemployed, after being fired from a job and feeling like there was no way forward. As someone in their mid-20s who has dealt with depression, anxiety, and professional failure, watching 23-year-old Yuri do his best despite his insecurities and past mistakes resonated with me in a way that most series haven't. Anime tends to focus on a specific age group when it comes to its characters, which tends to make it a bit harder to relate to for an adult viewer. Watching Yuri grow into himself, and watching Victor learn how wonderful dedicating oneself to another can be, legitimately made me want to try harder, to chase what I love, to be a better person. I fell in love with these characters and the efforts they made to better themselves and make something beautiful out of their lives. New Year's weekend, I was at a convention with some friends, and we all went ice skating. I've been terrified of ice skating rinks since I was a child, and never once tried it. I always had this irrational fear of falling and getting run over by someone else's skates. But much like an idiot child Naruto running in public, I was inspired by anime to try it. And you know what? I had a whole lot of fun. Really, that's only one instance of how much the show has inspired me to try new things. That's what I find so profoundly refreshing and cool about this series. The characters want nothing more than to better themselves. Even the most cynical characters don't actively try to sabotage one another. They're all simply doing their best at what they love. They don't settle for mediocrity in themselves. And their story inspired me to try new things, to be kinder to my friends, to go out into the world and find the thing I want to do and pursue it with every fiber of my being. Yes, the animation dips are noticeable and distracting, and yeah, the show probably could have benefited from a better thought out script. But I would be lying if I didn't say that the show instilled a real, tangible sense of optimism in me. This will probably sound stupid and overdramatic, but it honestly didn't matter what sort of crap life threw at me during Yuri on Ice's runtime, because Yuri Wednesdays were only ever a week away at most. Because all of these characters I fell in love with were waiting for me. Because if Yuri could get off his butt and chase his dreams, then I could too. And a lot of other people felt similarly. One of the best things about watching Yuri on Ice as it aired was the huge sense of emergent community. Remember all of the fan reactions after episodes 7 and 10? The slew of fan art following Otobek and Yurio's moment? The tangible sense of anxiety while we all waited for the last episode. I know every fandom has moments like this, but I felt a new level of collective investment every week as we all came together to cheer our boys on. It isn't technically even a part of the show, but this camaraderie deepened my affection for the series, and I really cherish that feeling of togetherness I had with other fans. Like the skaters it depicts, Yuri on Ice stumbles and falls from time to time, but it always got back up and tried again. So, is it worth all the hype? Of course not. Nothing ever is. But this series is something incredibly special to me and to a lot of other people. It brought hope and joy to so many fans all across the world throughout its run, and in my opinion, evoking such a strong emotional response is the highest thing any media or artwork can aspire to. It attempted a jump that most other shows wouldn't consider, and, in my opinion, it stuck the landing.